Hi, I'm Sara McMillan. I'm a professor at Iowa State University. I'm also with the Iowa Learning Farms, and today I'm joined by Wilke from the Nature Conservancy. Today we're here at an oxbow that's been recently restored in Kossuth County, and I'm really excited to learn a lot more about this process from you and kind of help share some of the lessons learned with our listeners in the community that is going to be watching the show.
So let's start with the basics. What is an oxbow and how are they formed?
So naturally, oxbows are formed in Iowa's landscape. If you kind of look at an aerial photo of Iowa, of any of the major rivers, you can see these little C-shaped kind of ponds or wetlands right along the river edge. So they kind of form in the floodplains. And how they happen over time is a river will naturally meander. It curves and it moves through the landscape as water flows. When storms come, they move the water much more quickly. And that fast flowing water also increases the speed of that water on the outer banks of those meanders. That causes excess erosion, and over time those meanders get bigger and bigger and bigger. When a big storm comes, those meanders that are really curvy and the water flows through a really tortuous path like that, the storm can cause the flow of the water to kind of break it off and short circuit that oxbow. So it creates a new path for the water to flow. Then over time, those pathways that are connecting that curve back to the stream can kind of fill in with sediment, and you can get this little off-channel C-shaped wetland or pond on the side. When these relic oxbows have been found in the landscape, what kind of restoration approaches work the best to help restore some of the natural functions that these might have?
Yeah, good question. So the details of the restoration are really going to depend on how degraded that wetland is. So oftentimes the wetlands that we're finding are just completely filled in with sediment, and so we're having to actually bring in an excavator and excavate 3 to 5 feet often of dirt out of that oxbow to allow it to get down to that historic riverbed that you were talking about and down to the historic wetland and allow it to hold water year round. Now that's kind of the extreme case, and when we do that we want to of course make sure that we're restoring it with nice gentle slopes and reseeding it to native vegetation when possible. However, sometimes maybe the creek is just really disconnected from the floodplain and we need to restore the connection between the wetlands and the creek. And in those instances, maybe we need to dig a connection channel between the oxbow and the stream. Or maybe it's a fully functioning wetland, but it just doesn't hold the water. And so we need to put in some sort of a water control structure or maybe an earthen dam to allow that wetland to hold its full capacity and really have maximum benefits for wildlife. Finally, another option is sometimes we just need to enhance the vegetation. Maybe it's filled in with trees, maybe we have less desirable vegetation around there, and so if we thin out the trees, open up the canopy, maybe seed some native plugs or native grass seeding and forbs, we can really enhance the habitat value for pollinators and other wildlife.
That's really helpful, Karen. It sounds like your restoration approach is simply to do some channel modifications perhaps, but also really just jumpstart the restoration with some native plantings and help get it going. So I have a follow-up question. What is the invasive species pressure at a place like this versus other kinds of restorations that we might do?
It's a little easier to maintain in a pasture setting like this because we've got the cattle grazing it, and this one in particular, is just in some grazing grasses, and so there wasn't really a lot of invasives in this setting to begin with. But in some areas that are maybe more wild or natural, we do have a lot of reed canary grass or willows that will creep in if it's not managed. So it's really up to the landowner and what they want on their property.
So this restoration has been done in a pasture setting, and I'm really curious about what are some of the things that you consider when you're doing such a restoration when you have livestock that are going to be accessing the oxbow that you just restored.
So for one thing, they're normally very small wetland restorations, and so they fit in very well in these small pasture settings and aren't taking a whole lot of land out of that pasture, so that fits in well. But besides just being compatible, we can have a lot of benefits actually for the livestock. So for instance, it's a really great watering source for livestock that's out of the stream. So they have this constant pool of water that they can cool off in, drink from, as well as when we're designing them, we're making sure that we're including safety features. So when a lot of these are filled in, they're very mucky. And so when we restore it, we're removing a lot of that muck and we're getting down to the sand or gravel bottom. So this is providing a more stable substrate for the cattle to be walking on and not getting stuck in the oxbow. And then we're gonna make sure that we have nice gentle slopes too, so they have easy access down into it. And then finally, we're helping to put the water where the landowner might want it on the landscape. So normally this pasture would flood all the time and this area would get wet and it would just kill all the grass anyways. So rather than trying to grow grass to graze on, let's just have this water source and put the water where it wants to be and allow the drainage to go into that actually, and keeping the rest of this a little bit more dry.
So you mentioned that you do some different types of reshaping of the banks to make sure that the livestock are safe, but also I'm guessing to make sure that the vegetation has a really good chance to grow. One of the things that I noticed when we walked up to this one is that you can see some of the water surface has come down a bit, and we've got some exposed banks. That really shows that shelf kind of that's been created for those livestock to almost take it down as a stair-step approach. Is that intentional, and how does that kind of evolve over the course of a wetland's life?
Yeah, exactly. So when we're doing these restorations in pasture, we want to make sure we have as gentle a slope as possible. And you may think that that's taking more pasture out, but it's not really. You're just having more grass at a gentle slope coming down into it. So that's one aspect we want to make sure we include. But as you said, we could do these kind of stair step down the banks to allow kind of level places for the cattle to congregate or make their way down. Another thing that we do that we didn't do at this restoration, but we often include, is what we call a bridge. And so we'll split the wetland in half and create a little bridge across.
Oh, cool.
So we're not going to dig it as deep as the rest of the wetland, but we're still digging a little bit. It might get wet seasonally, but most of the time the cattle will easily be able to get across the wetland rather than have to go all the way around. And it's also an easier spot for them to get down and into the water. So that's been a really nice characteristic for these pasture ones. And then finally, when we're designing these, we want to make sure that we're doing a seeding plan that's going to be successful for livestock and the wetland. So something that is quick to establish and stabilize those banks, something that is really hardy and will get in and establish really thick. And then also, when possible, we're going to promote natives. Natives can be as nutritious and palatable to livestock as other types of pasture grasses. And so if we plant something that's really durable, like a bulrush or switchgrass, that can really be successful in a setting like this. So Sara, I know you've done a lot of research on the water quality benefits of wetlands, and I'm curious what you've learned about oxbows in particular with wetlands, and maybe how that relates to the pasture.
I think the cool thing about oxbows and restoring oxbows has kind of two categories of benefits. The first one is that by providing a watering source for the cattle, we're keeping the cattle out of the stream. And so one of the big strategies when we think about streams and stream restoration and kind of creating healthy rivers is that we want to limit that access that livestock have to the stream. That serves two purposes. One, there's little direct inputs from the cattle coming into the stream, which is a really important thing to limit the amount of E. coli and other harmful bacteria that might be in the river. The other thing that helps keep that river healthy is if we keep the cows in the pasture and they aren't going into the stream, it keeps those banks really intact. And Iowa, like many states in the Midwest as around the world, we do have concerns with sediment and excess sediment moving through our river systems and then impacting further downstream. Those sediments are kind of kept in the banks and not flushed downstream. It keeps our rivers intact, it keeps our banks intact, and that helps to improve water quality. So simply just keeping the cows out of the stream, having another place for them to get water is really great. The second reason why they can be a really direct benefit for water quality is they act like a little treatment cell right adjacent to the river. So particularly in a pasture setting where you do have potential for things like excess nutrients, harmful bacteria, and other kinds of even gully erosion and sediment moving through a landscape such as this, they can actually capture all of that in the oxbow before it reaches the downstream water body. So couple things that are happening in that oxbow. Plants are taking up those excess nutrients, so that's removing them before they get downstream. The bacteria, those beneficial bacteria that actually live in our soils and help promote good soil quality, also live in the soils of wetlands, and those sediments at the bottom. Those are great at doing a whole host of things, particularly denitrification, which is just a big word to say that we're taking nitrate out of the water and turning it into nitrogen gas, which is a benefit for that water quality and removing that excess nitrate. And lastly, because like you can see this wetland behind me, it has a lot of open water. And what that means is we're having a lot of direct sunlight hitting the water surface. That sunlight neutralizes or almost basically inactivates a lot of those bacteria, so they become unable to reproduce and unable to make folks sick. So the sun is almost acting like its own little treatment reactor too. So we're doing a bunch of great things directly in the Oxbow, but also kind of indirectly by limiting access to the stream.